This book contains 30 stories about the children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there's something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to only be 1 story high with 30 classrooms all in a row, and instead it is 30 stories high with 1 classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having a sideways school. They have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to the class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story at Wayside School. And it has been said that these stories are strange and silly. And that may be true. But when I told the students at Wayside School the stories about you, they thought you were a little strange and silly too. And that's probably true. Story number 1, Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher at Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. If you children are bad, or if you answer a problem wrong, I will wiggle my ears and turn you into apples. Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count, but he knew if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't want to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf never taught him how to add. And one day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying from John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one. She stuck out her tongue and turned Joe into an apple. And then she turned John into an apple just for letting him copy. Hey, that isn't fair, said Todd. John was only trying to help a friend. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. Does anyone else have an opinion? Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. I don't allow crying in the classroom. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one. She stuck out her tongue and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. And when they went home, they were too scared to even talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school, and as soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "God bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one. She stuck out her tongue and turned Nancy into an apple. Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia, she tried to run away. She was halfway to the door when Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear began to wiggle. And Mauricia opened the door and had 1 foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue and turned Mauricia into an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on the desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The 3 Erics started laughing. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Mauricia, and the 3 Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Oven. Louis, the yard teacher, well, he walked into the classroom. See, he had missed the children at recess, and he heard that Mrs. Gorf was a really mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw the 12 apples sitting on her desk. I must be wrong. She must be a good teacher if she has this many students bringing her apples. He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Louis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples sitting on the desk. She must be the best teacher in the world. By the end of the week, all the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home. Now I don't have to teach anymore, and I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again. You're not going anywhere, said Todd, and he jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf in the nose. And the rest of the apples all followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. Stop, or I'll turn you into applesauce. But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children! Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She wiggled her ears, this time her left one first, then her right one. She stuck out her tongue and turned the apples back into children. All right, said Maricia. Hey, let's go get Louis. He'll know what to do. No! I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left one. She stuck out her tongue, but Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple, but none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. And then Louis, the yard teacher, walked in. Hey, where's Mrs. Gorf? Nobody said a word. Boy, am I hungry. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf. He shined it on his shirt, and he ate it. Burp.